Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning and happy Thanksgiving Eve to you. All right. Appreciate you being with me so very much. My name is Don K. Preston. This is what I call my morning musings. And we are summarizing in somewhat lengthy form, but we're summarizing and going back over the territory that we covered more in depth in our study of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. And I'm going to accelerate our summary here in the very near future. I'm wanting to hit some of these crucial nails, as I sometimes call them, nails in the wall that so very often futurists hang their hat on. Nail in the wall, hang your hat, blah, blah, blah. So I'm wanting to hit these highlights that are so crucial to the futurist view so that anyone can see, anyone with a open heart, can see that Jesus is not predicting by any stretch of the imagination the destruction of material creation in the Olivet Discourse. It is united discourse about one subject, the end of the Old Covenant age that occurred with the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, yesterday, we took a preliminary look at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35. Not going over the territory again, just simply ask you to consider. Since Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31 foretold the, quote, destruction of heaven and earth, unquote, then upon what hermeneutical principle and basis do we come to verse 35 and say, oh, well, you see, this is the destruction of literal heaven and earth? Or how do we take the metaphoric use of the language of Matthew 24, 29 to 31, as most amillennialists and postmillennialists do, and then come to verse 35, as Kenneth Gentry does, for instance, Keith Matheson does, for instance, and say, okay, metaphoric in Matthew 24, 29 to 31, verse 35, literal. Where is the hermeneutic? Folks, that's based strictly, solely, and exclusively on a presuppositional concept. A concept that says, an assumption that says, oh, the apostles asked about the destruction of, the literal physical creation, the end of the Christian age. Well, no, they didn't. And that is the greatest fallacy of the futurist views. So, yesterday we pointed out that Jesus said, this generation shall not pass until all of these things shall come to pass, shall be fulfilled. All of those things includes the passing sun, moon, and stars, and therefore of earth. Now, how can we correlate Jesus's answer to the apostles' questions when, in response to Jesus's prediction of the destruction of the temple and the city, and they immediately asked, tell us when shall these things be? And 99% of commentators say, well, see, all of these things refers to the destruction of the temple, the city, even the Old Covenant age, it's admitted. But now, in verse 35, we are told that Jesus changes horses in midstream, now starts talking about literal, physical, heaven and earth passing away. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you that that is simply not a contextual, nor is it a historically appropriate interpretation. Well, why do I say that? Well, point number one, throughout the Tanakh, I'm not going to go into great detail on this. I would just simply like to point out that in Isaiah 51, 6 and following, look to the heavens above, look to the earth beneath, for they shall vanish, but my righteousness shall never pass away. Well, what heaven and earth was he talking about? Well, according to Isaiah 51, verses 15 to 16, it's the heaven and earth that he gave when he gave Israel the law. Now, some take the position there that since Isaiah 51, 15 to 16 contains some future tenses, then it must be referring to the coming of the new heaven and the new earth. I'm sort of kind of okay with that, but the context of verses 15 to 16 still trouble me in taking that position, because the context is the destruction of some heaven and earth, a heaven and earth that was created when God put his law into the hearts and the minds of, quote, Zion, and said, "You are my people." I know that was Old Covenant Israel, right? So my point is that God created heaven and earth when he created Israel and gave them the law. Conversely, my question is, okay, is if Isaiah 51, 15, and 16 is talking about the future from Isaiah, saying, well, here is God making the promise that one day he would put his word in the hearts and the minds of, quote, Zion, which is interpreted to mean the new covenant Zion. Then what is the old covenant, or what is the heaven and earth that was to be destroyed in verse 6 and following? Well, that would necessitate that he's talking about the destruction of the old covenant world, the old covenant heaven and earth. Well, I'm okay with that too. So I vacillate between the two positions, all right? I do know that Jesus in Matthew 24, verse 35, is quoting almost verbatim from Isaiah 51, verse 6. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall never pass away. Matthew 24, 35. Isaiah 51, 51, verse 6. Look to the heavens above and to the earth beneath, for they shall perish. But my righteousness will continue forever. Jesus is directly echoing, drawing on Isaiah 51. By the way, many commentators have recognized that. Okay, so if that's the case, then that means that whatever Jesus was predicting in Matthew chapter 24, verse 35, the heaven and earth that he was predicting that was going to pass away must be the heaven and earth that he was predicting would pass away in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 6. If then we take the position, and I have for years, but again, I'm still open. If we take the position that Isaiah 51, 15, and 16 refers to the past of the time when God gave Israel the law at Sinai and said, "You are my people," then that means that the heaven and earth to pass away of Isaiah 51 was the old covenant heaven and earth. The old covenant heaven and earth created by the giving of the law. That, by the way, strongly corroborated by Isaiah 65, in which God threatened and said, basically in the last days, guess what he was going to do? The Lord God will slay you and call his people by a new name, Isaiah 65, 13 and following. For behold, I create new heaven and new earth. So here's God predicting the destruction of Israel and the destruction of heaven and earth, or the creation of a new heaven and new earth. Okay. We've got a real conundrum here, ladies and gentlemen. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you to consider this. Does your futurist eschatology of a coming new heaven and a new earth, Does it teach that the new heaven and the new earth will only come at the time of the destruction of old covenant Israel? You know, I have asked that question of debate opponents. I have asked that question of conversational and people who were objecting to covenant eschatology. And I've just simply asked them, does your view of eschatology teach that the new heaven and the new earth will only come at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem? And by the way, as a corollary question, does your eschatology teach that the resurrection only occurs at the time of the destruction of old covenant Israel? Now, you may go, well, Preston, why do you ask that question? Well, it's real simple. It's challenging, but it's real simple. The new heaven and the new earth only comes immediately after the resurrection. Revelation 20 through 22. So, given the fact that virtually all commentators, virtually all scholars, you just about don't find a scholar disagreeing with this. Since virtually all scholars agree that 2 Peter 3, Revelation chapter 20 through 22 are drawn directly from Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, and anticipated the fulfillment of Isaiah 65 and 66, does that not demand that the new heaven, new earth, after the great white throne judgment, after the resurrection, at the time of the wedding of the Lamb, only takes place at the time of the destruction of old covenant Israel? And remember, in Isaiah 65, 51 as well, that destruction of heaven and earth is posited directly in the context. The destruction of Israel, old covenant Israel, that had fallen into sin, that would fall into sin, reject the Lord. And let's not forget, this is critical. Paul, in Romans 10, 21 and 22, quotes verbatim from Isaiah 65, 1 and 2, to speak of Israel's rebellion and rejection of the gospel and the subsequent calling of the Gentiles. He applied it to his generation and to his ministry. So unless we are prepared to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt an insertion of so far 2,000 years between Israel rejecting the gospel and the calling of the Gentiles to bring in the fullness of the Gentiles, unless we are willing and able to prove categorically that that was first century, but we're still waiting for the new heaven, new earth, that means that heaven and earth passed in the first century. Well, I'm completely out of time. Thank you again so much for joining me here on Morning Musings. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving. I hope and I pray that you and your family have a joyful, thankful day. You know, in spite of all the problems, in spite of the injustices, the corruption, political, moral corruption, etc., we in America are so abundantly blessed. We live in a nation of freedoms, in spite of the fact that efforts are being made to strip those freedoms. Christianity is under a blatant attack in America. A Christian preacher was recently shot in California as he was standing on the street corner trying to share the gospel as he understands it. And it was reported that people passing by were yelling vitriol, hatred. Go away, leave us alone, stop preaching this garbage. See, 30 years ago, this would have been unknown. So yeah, America is attacking Christianity and Christians. But in spite of all that, I believe that we need to think seriously, gloriously, and beautifully about Paul's words. Thanks be to God for his unspeakable gift, the gift of his Son, the gift of redemption, salvation, and glory. Have a great Thanksgiving. I'll see you on Friday.